Daniel. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China in the World program here at Columbia University. And this is the final session of our speaker series for the fall semester. And we have a very special speaker who is a fellow in the program this year, 2021 to 2022. And she is Zhang, who sometimes goes by Stella Zhang. And Dr. Zhang is a postdoc at China in the World, and she's also a postdoc at the China Africa Research Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS, which is run by a very close friend of our program, Deborah Brodigam, who is a leading expert on China's development policies in the developing world. She studies how China's FDI and projects abroad, construction projects abroad and engineering projects abroad serve China's domestic interests, and how Chinese contracts and engineering projects project China's state capitalist development model abroad. These are very hot topics for all the people who are interested in China's development finance and investment around the world, and who are interested in President Xi's Belt and Road Initiative, which gets so much attention. She is a great public citizen of the field. She's co-editor of two projects. One is a journal, one is a People's Map of Global China, and then the journal Made in China, which is a quarterly journal. She's a co-editor of both of those. Before going into academia, she was a reporter at Caixin, the leading magazine in China on financial and political affairs. And she holds a PhD in public policy from George Mason University in the Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia. We were so thrilled when we were able to work out an arrangement with Johns Hopkins SAIS to have Dr. Zhang, to have Hong join us as she also joined the Hopkins program at the same time. And we consider this a great example of how two programs can both benefit through cooperation. That's one of the best win-win outcomes we've had in the history of China in the World. And we're thrilled to have her here, and we're thrilled that she's also benefiting from her time with the Hopkins program as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Hong, who will speak today on the internationalization of China's developmental state. Over to you, Hong.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, let me start sharing my screen. Okay. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. It's really my great pleasure to present my research today, which is based on my dissertation. So right now, the title is a bit longer than in the event ad page, Internationalization of China Developmental Statecraft in the Era of Belt and Roads. So I made it more clear that this research is addressed the Belt and Road context. So let me start by giving you an overview of my presentation today. It concerns two central questions. One is, how does China do BRI? And then how do we assess China's capacity in delivering BRI goals? And of course, my talk today cannot give a complete answer to these questions. I hope it does present a useful way of thinking, a useful way of thinking that can contribute to the already large body of BRI scholarship. And my analysis consists of two parts. First, I will explain how China's developmental statecraft formulates the BRI policy agenda. And second, more briefly, I will talk about the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor as a key case for examining the effectiveness of Chinese developmental statecraft going overseas. Needless to say, since the inception in 2013, the BRI has generated or has attracted a lot of scholarly attention. And I see that the majority of the studies, at least in the political science discipline, falls into two distinct perspectives. For IR scholars, I think they tend to view the BRI as a singular geopolitical or geo-economic grand strategy for China, which is also often conceived as a unitary actor to project power. Of course, I'm violently generalizing here. But on the other hand, there are also scholars analyzing the BRI more from the political economy perspective, showing how the subnational actors co-shape the BRI. For example, Li and Zhang in their 2019 article argue that BRI is an indeterminate scheme driven primarily by competing domestic interests, which will generate outcomes that often diverge from top leaders' intentions and may even undermine their key foreign policy goals. And Minye, in her works, conceptualized BRI as a state-mobilized globalization that builds on previous campaigns, such as China Going Global and Western Development Program to address China's economic crises. And James Riley, in his book on China's economic statecraft, characterized it as orchestration, where the Chinese state uses its hierarchical structure and attunement mechanism to maximize interest alignment between the central leaders' foreign policy goals and the interests of key implementing actors. And I think all these analyses are very useful in shedding light on the internal dynamics of the BRI. And my analysis also largely falls into the political economy perspective. But I think it seems we're still left with the difficulty of understanding what exactly is the core agenda of the BRI and how it evolves as a policy process. So that's where my analysis comes in. And so here's my reconceptualization of the BRI. I view it as a politically driven campaign centered on the message of development, in which policies are constantly being produced that collectively form an agenda. And here I highlight the concept of development, which is understood as a structural upgrading of both China's national economy and its position in the global economy. And this vision is probably best illustrated by the idea of dual circulation that was put forward by the Chinese leaders in 2020, very recently. So this dual circulation, China's internal market is to provide enough consumer power to drive its own growth. But at the same time, it remains open to the global trade and to benefit from the flows of resources and goods globally. But on the condition that it would take a more advantageous position in the global value chains. So in this sense, the goals of the developmental statecraft can be more structural and transformational rather than relational and transactional. That's often the goals that are discussed in the economic statecraft literature. By relational and transactional, I mean that these goals are often discussed as China trying to get a foreign country to do something that it would not otherwise do. So in my conceptualization of developmental statecraft, the goals are structural and transformational in the sense that they address the global economy as a whole and address China's China's structural position in it. So this is my overall conceptualization of the developmental statecraft. So this graph illustrates my conceptual model. I think that when we analyze the BRI, we can separate the political imperative or what Xi Jinping is aiming for or what he's urging the government officials to do from the developmental statecraft, which refers to the functions of the bureaucratic state structure. And political imperatives mobilize and activate developmental statecraft. And in return, developmental statecraft gives substance and operationalizability to political imperatives that tend to be vague and aspirational. And my analysis is situated in this substantialization part. And of course, my concept of developmental statecraft is inspired by the series of developmental state. It is a vast literature and I won't go into the detailed literature review here, but I want to just highlight a few key insights from this literature that are most relevant for my analysis. So from Chalmers-Johnson, the developmental state literature has focused on the competent bureaucracy that is capable of making industrial policies and spearing ahead innovation, and what this literature calls a pilot agency. In Robert Wade's study of East Asian developmental states, he highlights a corporatist element where the state gives a small number of interest groups, giving them a monopoly of sectoral interests in return for their discipline in following the state-defined interest. So in China, this pilot agency is no doubt the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC. Even though this agency was only established in 2003, it inherited from several heavyweight agencies in China's economic system, including, first of all, the State Planning Commission that was responsible for central planning in China's Soviet-style system in the past. And secondly, the State Council Office on Institutional Reform, which could be understood as the brain for China's economic transition from the planned economy to the market economy. And thirdly, the State Economic and Trade Commission, which used to administer the industries vertically. So NDRC is considered the most powerful agency under the State Council or China's cabinet because of its broad authorities in initiating major policies, and it's often dubbed the Little State Council. So here are some of the policy areas that falls under the jurisdiction or competency of NDRC. And to understand the core source of power of NDRC, it is necessary to look at the centrality of planning in China's governance system. And here, planning is no longer the Soviet-style output planning, quantitative output planning, but rather qualitative, programmatic planning that is often forward-looking and in addressing the structural needs. And so Sebastian Heyman and his co-author has this very excellent study of this kind of planning that China adopted since the 2000s. So to put it in a nutshell, China has established a rather intricate planning system for its economic and social governance. The foundation of this system is the National Economic and Social Development 5-year plans, or for short 5-year plans that we hear a lot about, which are passed by the National People's Congress and serve as law-like documents for all levels of government to set their policy agenda. And based on the 5-year plans, there are the functionary ministries and subnational governments making their issue-specific plans, such as those for environmental protection, social welfare system reform, etc. Or the regional development plans, as well as spatial planning, which mainly address the land use. And so all these planning interact with each other, and altogether they form China's very elaborate planning system. And I think it's fair to say that China's policymaking is undergirded by this planning system. They are very, very important. And so as this graph illustrates, NDRC plays a very important role in this planning system. Apart from drafting the national 5-year plans themselves, it is also in charge of drafting many issue-specific plans, as well as the macro-regional and sub-regional development plans. So these regional plans are characterized by their geographic coverage that is across provincial boundaries. As we know, provinces in China are very powerful players in the Chinese political economy. So this level of planning, the macro-regional and cross-provincial, sub-regional development planning really is meant to overcome the provincial interest and to promulgate development policies that better reflect national goals. And provincial and municipal development plans at the lower levels, as you see here, are supposed to align with the national plans that the NDRC drafts. And so altogether, they constitute this nested system of policy guidelines with cross-reference goals through which the political direction from the top trickles down to the lower level authorities. And there are some other arrangements in place that really reinforce NDRC's agenda setting power. And for example, NDRC's directors and deputy directors may enjoy higher administrative ranks than the other ministers, giving them a greater political authority when they try to coordinate with other ministries. And NDRC also supervise the plan making by other ministries, whose the other ministries' initiatives to make plans need to be approved by the NDRC in the first place. And also subnational governments' plan drafting and also any amendments to their plans, to their provincial developmental plans, would also need to be approved by the NDRC. Finally, as a micro-level control measure, the NDRC has the authority to approve fixed asset investment projects, so it can also veto projects that contradict its policy in its guidelines. And so having introduced the NDRC as a pilot agency in China's developmental state, let me now turn to how the developmental statecraft is used to promote the BRI. Here I identify 3 key tools or mechanisms, namely programmatic planning, corporatist interest aggregation, and platform building. So the first 2 are more for internal coordination, where and the third one is for external. And so let me elaborate now. So to explain the NDRC's role in the BRI's policy production, I will trace the evolution of the BRI. So in the initial stage of the BRI, is from 2013 to 15. It was the period when the policy framework or the policy foundation was being laid. So we know that the Belt and Roads were announced by Xi Jinping in 2 speeches in 2013. So at that time, it was merely very vague aspirations. So Xi Jinping suggested that China wanted to deepen its economic, social, and political ties with its neighbors in Asia. But what would that entail? I bet the political leader himself didn't know at that time. But his political drive set the developmental state in motion. And the NDRC was tasked to lead the strategic planning for the BRI, in which it led extensive consultations with other ministries and subnational governments. So as an NDRC, a senior official told the media, there were reports of over 1 million words that were produced in this process to produce the final strategic plan. And we can imagine this was when a lot of sectoral and provincial interests were lobbying for policy favors, and there was a lot of negotiation going on. And so by the end of 2014, the strategic plan was completed and approved by the State Council. And in March 2015, a document titled Vision and Actions on Jointly Building the BRI was published, which supposedly was a summary of the more elaborate strategic plan which was never published, which was kept internally. And so this document is now referred to by most of the external observers who are studying the BRI to see about BRI's agenda. So in this vision and action documents, it actually addressed the roles of the different regions. Although we often heard that one of the BRI's main purposes is to boost the economic development of China's poorer Western region, but as you can see in this table, actually every region in China has their role to play. And so this overarching plan gives general directions to what each region should prioritize, but it is also without being overly specific, so as to allow flexibility. For example, the northeastern provinces are to improve their transport links with Russia. And the metropolitan cities in China's inland provinces are to develop high ports, because of course they are not close to the sea, or to develop airline connected logistic parks. And these are not necessarily new initiatives. And many localities may have been doing these things for a long time, but having them confirmed in a national policy document gives these initiatives legitimacy. And having them placed together in the national plan also help the localities to consider how they compare to their neighbors and what kind of strategic niche they should aim for. And of course, the BRI policy production didn't stop here. Having laid out the framework in the vision and actions document that was published in 2015, subnational governments and central ministries then go on to make more specific plans. So the year of 2016 also happened to be the first year of the 13th five-year plans. And so we could see that all provinces, when they were drafting their 13th five-year plans, they have written into these plans how they were to incorporate BRI-related goals. And also between 2015 and 19, I found that various central ministries and DRC together, they have issued over a dozen plans in various policy areas. We can take a quick look here. So as you can see, they cover all kinds of areas. That went far beyond infrastructure construction that most commentators associate with the BRI. And so you can see like standard harmonization, science and technology, cultural, agricultural, energy, anything. So in this sense, BRI is really an all-out plan, all-out campaign to build ties with foreign countries in various policy domains. And so how are these macro level plans translated into micro level operations? One particular tool being used seems to be the so-called project reserve pool. So from early 2015, the central government had already started pushing for constructing a so-called project reserve pool in order to identify potential projects that can fit into the BRI agenda. And many provincial and municipal governments also follow suit by building their own project pools. While most of these project pools are not made public, from media reports that I gathered, they seem to involve registering the basic information of the projects as a way to organize the work required to make these projects happen. And also these projects are managed dynamically, meaning that when some projects have been completed, new projects need to be identified and replenish the pool. And so many provinces also set up their own funds to support these projects, but they also seek to nominate their projects or submit their projects to the national pool, because the inclusion of these projects into the national pool would mean support from the central government. So, and the RC is responsible for selecting the projects. And according to media reports, for projects to be selected into the national pool, the considerations include whether the host country has good political relations with China, whether the host government prioritizes the projects in question, or whether such projects would facilitate the upgrading of China's domestic industry or to boost regional market development. And so now let me turn to an important policy area, the so-called International Production Capacity Cooperation, IPCC, in which I think there's a lot of corporatist interest aggregation going on. And IPCC is a distinct policy initiative that emerged in 2015 when the state, so it was kind of generated, this policy area actually kind of emerged in parallel to the BRI. And so in 2015, the State Council issued a guidance document that formally introduced this policy and also identified 12 industries to receive priority support. So as you can see from this list, they include both the old industries that have overcapacity problems, such as steel, cement, textile, these kind of things where China has already developed a very mature industries in China that have a lot of overcapacity that China needs to transfer abroad. And also the new industries that China has developed its own indigenous technology that China wants to promote the international transmission of these technologies, such as telecom, aerospace, things like that. And so in the following years, NDRC reached out to 21 provinces to build something called Commission Province Synergy Mechanisms. And these mechanisms or these agreements identify priority industries and also target countries, and even specific projects for each province to engage in the IPCC, in productive capacity cooperation. And NDRC promises greater support for these provinces, such as including their projects into international negotiations or into their country-specific plans, and all recommending these provinces' projects to the central financial institutions to get financing. And the provinces, in return, promise making available policy incentives at a local level, and also actively updating the project pool in order to build up the momentum for IPCC. And similarly, NDRC also signed agreements with China's major financial institutions, including the policy banks, insurance company, commercial banks, and investment bank, to coordinate with them in the IPCC in terms of policy guidance, functional collaboration, and information sharing. In addition, very interestingly, I think NDRC instructed many industrial associations, and these industrial associations were already under NDRC's tutelage. And these associations were to establish so-called corporate alliances for IPCC in 15 sectors, as you can see from this list. They largely correspond to the 12 industries that are listed above. And so these corporate alliances are supposed to both channel the policy directions from the above to their member companies, and at the same time to lobby for policy support for their member companies. So at least some of the alliances have the mandate of representing their sector in the intergovernmental policy negotiations, and some others also call for member companies to submit their project proposals, which upon the approval of the NDRC can enjoy policy support or be recommended to financial institutions. So this graph illustrates the mechanisms that I've just talked about. So by running a national project pool, NDRC can select projects submitted by the provinces or recommended by financial institutions or the industrial associations. And after all aggregating all these regional and sectoral interests, NDRC can then channel these projects in their international outreach with the foreign governments. So, and this is this outward-facing aspect of this developmental statecraft that I will now turn to. So this, what I call platform building mechanism, refers to such institutionalized cooperation mechanisms with foreign countries that can be used for communicating their policy priorities or aligning policy priorities between China and partner countries, or they can be used to funnel projects from their domestic constituencies in their intergovernmental discussions, and also they can construct the working mechanisms to enable the realization of these, implementation of these projects. And this is why this policy communication pillar was the very first of the 5 pillars of the BRI. So the other pillars include infrastructure connectivity, which everyone is talking about, also the financial integration, trade, and also people-to-people exchange. But policy communication is placed as the primary position. And NDRC plays a major role again in this policy communication with BRI partners. So far there has been over 200 agreements signed with with 140 countries in the world, plus over 30 international organizations. So these are, the first step for China to build these international connections with BRI countries. So this table lists the new international economic cooperation mechanisms NDRC has established since 2013 with various countries, as you can see. And so this just give you an idea of which countries and issues NDRC is working on. It seems Pakistan and Kazakhstan are the two countries where the greatest progress has been made. As you can see, Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is the country where China, is a pilot country for China to test out this so-called production capacity and investment cooperation. So there have been 18 meetings under this mechanism so far. And China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is, which I will talk about more later. Also, Pakistan is a country with the most extensive cooperation, I would say, with China. But of course, not all of these mechanisms are going great. For example, the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Economic Corridor, which is one of the 6 economic corridors outlined in the 2015 documents, seems to be going nowhere, I think largely because of India's resistance to join the BRI. And so, yeah, these are just some of the examples. And I will also like to note that this kind of international outreach by the NDRC is relatively new, because NDRC has traditionally been an agency that works on domestic issues, unlike other ministries such as Ministry of Commerce that has been traditionally dealing with a lot of international trade and investment. And so this chart shows the number of international cooperation agreements NDRC and its predecessors have signed between 1984 and 2019. So the green bars represent the post-2013 periods, and the orange bars are in the previous decade, since 2003, when NDRC was established, and 2012, the year before BRI, and then the blue bars were the agreements signed by NDRC's predecessors. So as you can see, just in the 7 years since 2013, there were already more agreements, international cooperation agreements signed by NDRC than all the agreements signed in the previous 30 years combined. And so, and also the largest group of agreements signed in this period, in the post-2013 periods, was about this industrial cooperation capacity cooperation, international production capacity cooperation. And I think this is just one indication that China's developmental statecraft is moving towards internationalization. So let me briefly summarize my analysis of China's developmental statecraft so far before we move on to the next part. I think the analysis shows that the Chinese developmental state has distinct capacity in strategizing and planning for development policies and to promulgate and maintain a core agenda, even if, as other scholars have found out, it cannot control everything. Therefore, I think the globalization process is not as centrifugal as a force as other scholars suggest. Second, I think there are many corporatist mechanisms available for aggregating regional and sectoral interests, but these mechanisms are close in nature, and so there's great risk for elite collusion. And third, the pilot agency is now channeling these domestic interests to international cooperation platforms, but as such platforms proliferate, as required by the increasingly global nature of the BRI, it can result in stretching of the bureaucratic capacity, which, because the bureaucratic capacity is, of course, not unlimited. So as I argued that China's developmental statecraft is internationalizing, meaning that it is increasingly working in international settings rather than just domestic setting, it is necessary to examine how it is working overseas. And this is why I chose to study the case of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is considered the flagship project in the BRI. And I think this is not just a rhetoric, because as I do find that China and Pakistan's development cooperation is probably the most extensive and institutionalized among all its BRI partners. And so in the remaining time, I will briefly discuss how these tools in China's developmental statecraft are performing in Pakistan, although I may not be able to go into a very deep analysis because of time constraint. And this research draws from my fieldwork in Pakistan, just done right before the pandemic. Very fortunately for me to be able to make this trip, but unfortunate that I couldn't make any follow-up trips after that. So first, a little background about the CPEC. This cooperation, no doubt, builds on the very close political relations between the two countries. And these political relations, such political relationship to a large extent is motivated by China and Pakistan's common goal of counterbalancing India. So in fact, the CPEC cooperation MOU signed between the two countries, it was actually signed in July 2013. That was even before Xi Jinping delivered his speeches about Belt and Road. So it actually predated BRI. And the initiative for building CPEC also built on cooperation between the two countries that started to intensify already since the mid-2000s. So in the decade prior to 2013, when the CPEC came into place, China had at least 57 agreements for cooperation in various fields with Pakistan, such as energy and science and technology. So the two countries also had 2 5-year plans for economic and trade cooperation in 2006 and 2010. And this kind of 5-year plans for economic and trade cooperation, it was actually China pioneered this kind of plans with Pakistan, and later also extended to other neighboring countries such as India, Vietnam, and Thailand. And also the idea of a trade and energy corridor was actually first proposed by the Pakistani side. By then the Pakistani president Pervez Musharraf back in 2006. But this proposal initially was met with very little interest from China. And it was not until after 2010 that China started to take this idea more seriously and started to study it. And I think that was what led to this proposal of CPEC in 2013. So all this is to say there are many good reasons why the CPEC became a flagship or a pilot project in the BRI. So as I mentioned earlier, bilateral cooperation with Pakistan is probably the most institutionalized among all BRI partners. And this table shows the institutional structure for CPEC cooperation. So immediately after the CPEC MOU was signed, a joint cooperation committee was established, which is led by the NDRC on the Chinese side and the Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiatives, MPDS, on the Pakistani side. And this would be the overarching decision-making body for the CPEC. And so far, the JCC has met 10 times, with the latest one was in September this year, after a long delay, and the delay was due to the pandemic, but also due to concerns about security situations, because just in July and August, there were two incidents of terrorist attacks targeting Chinese engineers in Pakistan. So the JCC meeting was originally supposed to happen in July, was postponed until September. So, but overall, the JCC mechanism has established a relatively rigorous communication channel between the two countries. And then under the JCC, there are more specialized joint working groups in charge of specific areas of concern. As you can see from their years of establishment, new groups were gradually added as the CPEC cooperation expanded in scope. So in the initial years, there were the joint working groups of planning, energy, transport infrastructure, GUADAR, and industrial cooperation, which reflected the priority areas when the CPEC was just started out. And also when the PMLN government, the Pakistan Muslim League, Nawaz government, PMLN government was in power. And then later, working groups was gradually added, and these agriculture and technology working groups reflected the shifting priority of the current PTI government that came into power in 2018. And also, as you can see, NDRC chairs several of the working groups, including planning, energy, GUADAR, and special economic zones, and the rest are chaired by the other relevant ministries in China. But altogether, as you can see, that there is a great level of mobilization of different government agencies, ministries from China and from Pakistan too, to cooperate through this platform. And in terms of the output of the CPEC, we can look at this table that tabulates the CPEC projects. So to date, there are 23 projects that have been completed and another 30 under construction, and with more in the public pipeline. And most of the completed projects are in the energy sector. Actually, when I say energy, it's electricity. And these early harvest projects, including energy and transportation projects and telecommunication projects, have added a great amount of electricity generation capacity to Pakistan, and also making available a great distance of new roads and also optic fiber, this kind of infrastructure. By contrast, the special economic zones, none of the special economic zone projects have been completed. And so in the following, I would just try to analyze these two sectors, energy and special economic zones, to try to explain this contrast. So my interviews with multiple Pakistani government officials indicate that specific projects were typically proposed by the Pakistani side, which were then discussed at the joint working groups, the specific joint working groups, and then the NDRC would determine if to fund these projects after consulting with the other ministries in China. And so for Chinese funded projects, it is up to the Chinese side to nominate a short list of Chinese companies from which the Pakistani side can select. And if a project involves Chinese loans borrowed by the Pakistani government, then usually a public tendering process will be required. But if a Chinese company manages to have signed an MOU, if they have already been in discussion, in talk with the Pakistani government agencies that are the executing agency of the CPEC projects, then usually priority consideration is given to these companies. And also in the case of investment projects, as opposed to loan projects, and actually most of the electricity power projects are investment projects, then no tendering is required. So whatever Chinese company that are interested may directly negotiate with the Pakistani government. And so looking at this, what this tells us is that while the project selection is driven by the Pakistani demand, the Chinese company's participation seemed to be a nearly necessary condition. So let's take a closer look at the energy sector. Of the 17 priority energy sectors, only one of them is 100% invested by a Pakistani government company. All the other had either fully invested by Chinese companies or majority invested, or Chinese company had the minority share. But all these projects involve Chinese companies as the construction contractors. And the Chinese company that is involved in most of the CPEC energy projects is China Machinery Engineering Corporation, which is a central government-owned or a subsidiary of the central government-owned enterprise. And it's not surprising because this company has been active in Pakistan since 1983, and so it knows the market pretty well. So I think Pakistan's energy sector seems to be a particularly ready sector for receiving Chinese developmental statecraft. And just to recap, the developmental statecraft, it involves a top-level sectorial planning, and then the intergovernmental agreements that set out the parameters for cooperation and to specify the responsibilities of each side. And then under this framework, the projects can be identified, and then based on this, the state can solicit industrial actors or the financial institutions to implement these projects. And alternatively, the companies and financial institutions may also identify projects and then lobby them to be included in the international intergovernmental agreements. So, and I think there are a number of reasons why this model works particularly well in the energy sector in Pakistan. One is that both countries have already started the cooperation since mid-2000s, as I mentioned earlier, and especially in the energy sector. So there was already a lot of policy communication and information sharing going on. And partly related to that, Chinese companies had already secured a strong foothold in Pakistan's power generation sector by the late 2000s, although they were mostly there as contractors of the projects rather than investors. But these companies knew the market very well, which was also why they could be quick. It would be quick for them to identify potential projects to be included in the government's initiative. And third, there was very strong political support from the Pakistani government, specifically the PMLN government in power between 2013 and 18, because since 2000s, in early 2010s, Pakistan was suffering from very severe energy shortage. So the PMLN government had made this a very important item on their political campaign to address Pakistan's power shortage. So building energy projects was very high on the government's political agenda. And finally, there was already a very accommodative regulatory environment for energy investment in Pakistan in place. So already in the early 2000s, Pakistan already established a very elaborate policy framework for incentivizing private investment into the power sector. And to also, based on research by Erica Downs, to facilitate the CPEC, the Pakistani government was also willing to provide special treatment to Chinese investors, such as revolving funds and payment with the Chinese currency, etc., etc. So the stories with the special economic zones, however, is very different. So SEZs are considered a very important mechanism for both countries to promote industrial cooperation. And by building SEZs, it was hoped that Pakistan could receive factories, companies relocated from China. So, the SEZ site selection already actually started back in 2015. But unlike the energy sector, where the Chinese companies and their Pakistani partners were in a good position to quickly identify potential projects, the SEZ site selection was at the hands of the government, and that's why politics came into play. And Pakistan is a federal system with very strong ethnic party presence in each of the 4 provinces, so Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balochistan, and Sindh provinces. These 4 provinces each have their strong ethnic parties and just traditional power bases. So in order to balance these regional interests, the Pakistani government initially suggested to have 2 to 3 SEZs selected for each province. But when NDRC heard this idea, it was like, oh, this is not really a good idea, because it's better, NDRC kind of suggested that it's better start with one and see how it goes. So eventually 9 SEZs were selected, including one site for each of the 4 provinces, as well as one for each of the 3 special administrative units, including the AJK, Gilgit-Baltistan, and also the FATA region that's bordering Afghanistan. And there were another 2 for the federal government, one near the capital Islamabad and the other near the port of Qasim. So as you can see, this is mainly out of consideration of, balancing different interests, political interests. But even though the 9 were selected, only 4, the 4 belonging to the 4 provinces, were really giving serious policy support and prioritized in the actual implementation. And also, according to Pakistani constitution, SEZ governance falls under the provincial competence. And so each province may have different regulatory requirements for the SEZs. At the same time, the different provinces also have different capacities in terms of fulfilling their responsibilities for SEZ development, including clearing the land and providing the infrastructure and so on. So of the 4 provincial SEZs, the one in Balochistan has not really started, because security situation in Balochistan is really quite unstable. And also, this is a very poor province, and it's hard to see how industries can be developed in this province that is also sparsely populated and with very few skilled labor. And in Punjab and in Sindh provinces, their provincial governments decided that they would develop their SEZs on their own. And even though Sindh province wanted to have some kind of public tendering for SEZ development, and some Chinese company also tried to place the bids, it later withdrew, largely due to the pandemic. So also these 2 SEZs were not really making progress. Only in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in KP province, the SEZ was entrusted to, it was entrusted to a Chinese company, China Road and Bridge Corporation, which has been trying to attract investment from China. They have been hosting events in China and try to advertise this opportunity. But again, this seems to be out of some political reason, because KP province is the power base of the current PTI government. So let me try to sum up the contrast between the 2 sectors. So in the energy sector, the Chinese project initiation capacity is very strong because of the established market presence of Chinese companies. And also they have large rooms to benefit either as investors or as contractors in these energy projects. But this is not the case with the SEZs. The Chinese companies largely do not have experience in Pakistan for this kind of business development. And also to profit from the SEZ projects is not straightforward. As SEZ developers, they would have to secure enough investment into these zones and to manage it for the long term. So the SEZs, so the room for the Chinese companies' interest is really moderate. And also in terms of the political support, the SEZs did not receive as much political support as in the energy sector, for the reason I explained earlier. Energy was very important for the previous government. And also in terms of the regulatory environment for SEZs, it's also unclear, because every province has their own regulation, and sometimes it's not quite clear, and also because they vary across regions. So it's quite, it's not as accommodative for investors as in the energy sector. So, however, as this energy sector enjoyed early success, and it also helped institutionalize this particular model of planning agreement project, the pyramid shape that I just I showed earlier. So this model was kind of institutionalized or kind of inform the later collaboration. So, but in that sense, it also, this model could be counterproductive for developing other sectors. There were some Pakistani officials who complained that these earlier model introduced by NDRC officials actually were not really beneficial for the long-term development under CPEC. So just to conclude, I think my presentation demonstrates the distinct developmental statecraft at work in the BRI, which is especially effective in mobilizing domestic interests, but also its overseas applicability is very limited because the political and regulatory environments in other countries could be very different from China's. So I think that kind of concludes my presentation now. I still have some more slides I can share, but maybe in the Q&A section if you are interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Hong. I know you'll get some questions. I know I have some, and maybe I'll start with mine. You know, I'll just make a couple of comments. I mean, it's a great project. My comments have to do with maybe show my views of the BRI and over several years. And back when I was at Princeton, I made this point as well, that it seems like if the BRI is created as a vague set of directions to a bunch of different provinces who then look across boundaries and compete with each other, that it runs the danger of becoming a kind of traditional Chinese economic campaign that will lead to a lot of irrational policies, because it will create hyperactivity, competitive investment that are not necessarily based on economic needs, and a lot of waste. So that's just a background comment, and it's going to inform my question, because I was really fascinated by your graph where you showed the three phases, 1984 to 2003, 2003 to 2012, and 2013 to the present. And you had the bar graph, because it looked like the outward investment was accelerating, the project account was accelerating pretty quickly between the first and the second periods, before BRI ever started. So you had a kind of trajectory that BRI continued and maybe accelerated even further because of this political incentive by the NDRC channeling the great leader's desire to have his great program, the BRI, pushed forward. But there was a lot of activity in 2003, 2012, and a lot of that activity was in Pakistan in the energy sector, from your own reporting. And that was the most successful of the programs in terms of the percentage of good projects, et cetera, by your own statistics. So I'm wondering how much of this is actually BRI, how much of it is just China's economic posture in the world and the need to export capital and construction projects because of overcapacity. And it seems like the pre-BRI part of your story is very much that, and that if it continued along this path, a lot of what is captured by BRI would have happened anyway. And then there's some additional stuff on top of that that maybe is wasteful, and maybe that's why you see so much of the SEZ problems. Maybe it's just to please the political leaders that this is happening, rather than making investments in things that are needed in the country in question and are economically rational in the country in question. feeding off of that, and I'm saying a lot, so there's a lot to respond to.
Yeah.
I wonder about Xi Jinping's commitment on climate change, his recent commitment to halt financing for energy projects. Because I found your graphs really and your tables really fascinating and informative. It looks like there's a lot of projects that are under construction. And there are probably a lot of more projects that are contracted and are not yet under construction. So I know this from the arms control world, that China can make commitments to halt certain activities, but then we'll discover that those activities are still happening after the promise to halt them. And the response is often, well, this was contracted and agreed to before we made the promise. So the promise doesn't apply. It's grandfathered. We use the term grandfathered, these projects. And I wonder how many of these energy projects might fall into that category of, are we going to see another 150 coal-fired power plants built abroad after the pledge not to finance new ones, because the financing has already been pledged, that those deals are done. We're not going to back off on those. And that has a big impact on climate change. And then the last thing, and I have a lot, but I'm going to turn it over to everyone else and I'm going to stay quiet, is I noticed that some of the projects you said were in the regions near Afghanistan. And I just wonder, because I'm interested in politics, and in addition to the sort of economics of these things and the bureaucratics of these things, I wonder what your take is. And if you want to answer this later after you answer some other questions, that's fine. I wonder what your take is on these actors involved in the NDRC and the outward bound investment with CPEC as the core. And CPEC started before BRI. I mean, that was very clear from Erica Downs's work, that it started before BRI and it became the biggest BRI project, but it started before. How do they feel about the collapse of the government in Afghanistan and the takeover of the Taliban? Because the kind of narrative in the United States is there's a lot of glee in Beijing. The US failed and China has special opportunities now. But I can't help but thinking that they're worried that chaos in Afghanistan will lead to more terrorist attacks on Chinese projects in the CPEC, which is the biggest part of the BRI, and that they're not worried about instability, and maybe they're not celebrating quite as much as fearful Americans think. And that's it. That's a lot of questions, but it's a good sign. When there's a lot of questions, that means like it's a really good talk. So.
Yeah, thank you. So, wow, these are very difficult questions too. So the last question: how does NDRC and China in general views Pakistan, Afghanistan? I don't have a direct answer to that, but indeed, Afghanistan has featured in China's overall plan for Pakistan. I mean, for CPEC, because CPEC has been envisioned not just for Pakistan's domestic development, but also as part of the domestic development for Pakistan, also trying to stimulate regional economic development. That would include Afghanistan and the Central Asia. And also a very important project I didn't have time to talk about, Gwadar ports in CPEC. Originally it was conceived as something that, Gwadar port would be the outlets on the southern coast of Pakistan, and then it would build the trade route all the way up to Xinjiang. But that idea seemed to be gone because the transportation is just impossible this way. And so I think later on, the idea about the vision for Gwadar port becomes something it would become a transshipment hub for the region. And one of the things would be help to become a transshipment hub for Afghanistan. So in that sense, in the Afghanistan's stability and also all the infrastructure that should be put in place in order to enable this trade from Afghanistan to Pakistan, and then make use of Gwadar port, because really nowadays Gwadar port doesn't seem to have that many viable business models. So in that sense, I think China will be very interested in Afghanistan's stability and development. But I don't think there's such rush to really go into Afghanistan at this stage, because I think it's pretty clear that the situation, security situation, was very complicated, and also just recently there were terrorist attacks on Chinese engineers, and the Pakistani side said that these attacks have to do with Afghanistan and India. So I think with all these doubts and uncertainties, I don't think there's that much rush into trying to make more concrete plans for Afghanistan. And for the question about the climate change investment, so Xi Jinping's promise was to stop, his words were stop building coal projects overseas. And nobody really knows what building means. Building, does it mean Chinese finance projects or projects that are contracted to Chinese companies? Or so there's no clarity yet. So we still need to see how that will be clarified. But at least I think some of the Chinese banks are starting to, they promise that they will not finance any more coal projects overseas. But like I said, like Chinese companies, many of Chinese companies have been very actively building projects as contractors. And so it might be hard for them to really withdraw from this sector entirely. It would be huge loss. So we still need to see how it would develop. And just in terms of how new is BRI, I think this is always a question, like how new is BRI? Would many of these projects have happened anyways without the BRI? I think what makes BRI really different is the level of activism on the part of the Chinese government in making all these outreach to foreign governments. That includes both the central government and the subnational governments, and they really are trying all kinds of ways to build ties. So in that sense, I do believe it could boost international economic activities compared to the going out era, which was more like decentralized and just led by the companies themselves. Right.
So just to follow, the last thing I'll say is, if that's true, if there was a trajectory of going out and it was going up pretty quickly before 2013, and then it went up even more quickly because of the BRI initiative, wouldn't it be logical to think that there would be a higher percentage of economically irrational projects in the post-2013 period, because people would be doing it largely to please them, the political movement, rather than making decisions based on economic interests?
Yeah, I think that's very likely, even though I don't know how I can measure it, but yeah, I think that's a logical conclusion.
All right, thanks. Well, I'll turn it over to others. I took too much time, but it was a great talk, and I really learned a lot. Why don't you start with Teng Biao? I think he was first.
Yes, he was. Teng Biao's question, he is the Posen visiting scholar at the University of Chicago and a longtime friend of the program here at CWP from our days at Princeton, asks, besides the economic purpose, does the BRI have important political agenda? For example, to control the ports, railroads, and strategic resources, to export the authoritarian quote-unquote China model, to press the BRI countries not to criticize CCP's human rights abuses, debt trap, etc.?
Yeah, I think, is there a political agenda? The way I would answer is that I don't think there's a direct purpose, like China doing all this with this political agenda in mind, that I am investing this to silence the criticism from this government. I'm doing this to impose, authoritarian rule as a model to other countries. I don't think that's a direct purpose. But they could result in this kind of effect, like other countries when they have a lot of economic interaction, economic interest, dependency on China. Naturally, some of them might reconsider if there's some controversy and they need to make a position. They might want to side with China or be silent, be quiet. So it could have this kind of effect, although I don't think that's a purposeful agenda in play.
But what about exporting authoritarianism? Because that's a hot topic, right? And your title kind of suggests that China's exporting its model through the BRI, but your talk is really about exporting a kind of a developmental state economic plan, not necessarily a political plan. Is that right?
Right. So yeah, maybe I need to clarify what I mean by this internationalization of developmental statecraft. There's always been a lot of debate about whether China is exporting its and China model, however China model is defined. I think China is trying to spread some of its developmental state practices, very specific practices such as planning, such as very state-led investment, this kind of thing. But I don't think there's such attempt to really export the whole model. That model includes the political system and everything, and one-party rule. I don't think that was in the mind of the policymakers or in the political leadership.
Okay,
yeah.
Thanks. So Daniel, turn to someone else. Thanks.
Thanks so far. Next question comes from Austin Strange, who is one of this year's fellows for the China in the World program, as well as an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong. And he asks, on the last of the three mechanisms, does the Fa Kai Wei or the Development and Reform Commission's inexperience with international policy outreach help explain China's struggle to tell the story of the BRI successfully around the world? Or do you think this is unrelated and simply due to environmental factors? For example, China's structural rise, aggressive diplomatic rhetoric elsewhere, etc. Relatedly, if another government agency were the pilot agency, such as MOFCOM, MFA, or some other organ/agency in the Chinese Communist Party, how do you think the management of the BRI or the BRI's image would be different? Or is it just a matter of domestic political rank and coordination across agencies?
Yeah, thank you, Austin, for this question. I've never thought of it this way. But I think in terms of telling the China story, there's always a very clear division of labor. I mean, telling the China story is the job of not just the Chinese diplomats, but also the Chinese Communist parties, the propaganda departments and all these state media. So whether it's NDRC in the leading position or MOFCOM or any other ministry, I don't think it would be that different in terms of creating a narrative for BRI. Sorry, what's the second part of the question? I forgot.
Second part of the question was...
It's about different agencies. So is the NDRC bad at public diplomacy because it doesn't have much experience with it? Since it's the head of the BRI gets a bad reputation abroad because they don't know how to manage it. What if MOFCOM or Ministry of Foreign Affairs was in charge because they have more experience abroad? Would they do a better job of selling or marketing the BRI in the political realm, and would it be less criticized?
Yeah, I think it probably wouldn't make a difference because of the entities, the organizations that would be telling the China story will still be the same. But I also think it's almost inevitable that NDRC is in such a central role because BRI to a large part is motivated by domestic development needs. So NDRC, of course, would have to be in the central position.
Gotcha. Next question comes from Karen Zhu, who is the PhD candidate, Party Rand Graduate School, and assistant policy researcher at the Rand Corporation. And she asks, hi Stella, great to see how your research has evolved in theoretical depth. I have a comment in terms of theory development. It would be interesting to analyze how the structural, transactional related aspects of the Chinese development state interact with each other. For example, two cases may be explored. One, how NDRC's functions, how it functions as the pilot agency may differ in planning and delivering when it comes to domestic projects versus overseas projects, and how those roles in government and corporate players play into this process. Number two, regarding your critical case of CPEC, faced with sea change in regional geopolitical dynamics since the Taliban took over, similar to Tom's question, how has Chinese governmental agencies, policies, and actions evolved, and how then in turn this may shape Pakistan's response and future trajectory of the CPEC?
Yeah, thank you, Karen, for the questions. I know you know a lot about CPEC, and also you know a lot about NDRC. So thank you for the comments. And I really don't have a good answer to your questions since the Taliban came into power. Like I tried to answer before, I think there was an interest to really incorporate Afghanistan in terms of regional development, and also for CPEC to have this long-term prospect. But other than that, I don't know how, or maybe it's still too soon to tell how China and Pakistan will respond differently. But I noticed that interestingly, there were a very high-profile Pakistani official delegation coming to the U.S. and they have been introducing CPEC, and also I feel the atmosphere is very different now compared to during the Trump administration, because at that time, during Trump administration, the former Chinese U.S. ambassador to Pakistan was actually Alice Well. She was making speeches about CPEC and saying that beware of the debt trap from China. So it was a lot of tension. And then this time, when the Pakistani government officials were here in Washington D.C., it seems from just based on their open public events, it seems that the U.S. side was more like showing more accommodating or more supportive of the CPEC, and also I think this diplomatic outreach, also Pakistani government's the intention to really restore relationship with the U.S. government, and in a way kind of reduce its dependence on China. And that doesn't mean that Pakistan is choosing sides between China and U.S., because actually traditionally U.S. has been quite supportive of China's engagement in Pakistan, and vice versa. I mean, China was welcoming U.S. role in security in the region. So I think these are all interesting development in international politics. But sorry, I don't have a good answer as to specifically regarding Afghanistan.
Our next question comes from Yuan Wang, who is another one of this year's CWP fellows. And she asks, during my interviews with BRI projects on the ground, the NDRC was simply not an active BRI agency that is mentioned, at least in her experience. The active agencies were MOFCOM, MOFA, policy banks, and the SOEs. And an informant from the NDRC said that the NDRC was originally leading the BRI, but gradually lost its leading position and is struggling to regain it. So she's wondering, maybe this loss of control of the NDRC by the BRI supports the centrifugal tendencies of the BRI in general?
Yeah, thank you, Yuan. I would say NDRC is probably not mentioned that much on the ground level, because it's really working more on agenda setting level, more on the strategic level rather than on the implementation. Of course, when it comes to implementation, NDRC is largely irrelevant. MOFCOM and the other agencies, and especially financial institutions, are probably most important when it comes to actual implementation, specific project implementation. But the reason why I focus on NDRC is really I want to highlight this on the higher level, how this agenda was made. What's the connection between China's own development, the statecraft within China, the way how the Chinese state tried to develop its domestic economy, and how that is linked to the overall BRI's outward-facing agenda.
Our next question comes from TK Chu, who is another long-time friend of the program. He asked a couple questions. I'll just do the first one. TK Chu is a physicist who used to work at the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory and asks, are there institutions in the United States that are similar to the NDRC in terms of trade and commerce? Not in terms of military background, as the Pentagon tends to pick up a lot of that, but specifically in trade and commerce. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know. I don't think there is. Of course, I'm not a US politics expert, but I can't see any agency that has the similar kind of role as NDRC in the US government. Of course, I mean, NDRC is really the reason why there is such an agency in the Chinese government really has to do with its legacy from the planned economies, and also just, China as a centralized political system with the central government having a great role in all kinds of policy matters. So in that sense, I don't think it's possible for US to have something similar. In terms of the 5-year plans, or difference between 5-year plans between China's qualitative and Soviet's quantitative, what difference? So the Soviet style quantitative planning was really about input-output planning, because everything needs to be budgeted, and you need to calculate how much you want to produce, and you need to calculate how much input you need in order to produce. So that was the Soviet style planning. But the kind of planning that NDRC is engaged in, I think, is more about what structural needs to be addressed. How do you envision the economy going forward, and also what kind of policy would be needed to address needs related to economic development that would include things like environmental policies, energy policies, and this kind of more qualitatively defined policy areas. So they are really not comparable.
Yeah, Zhang, if I could just say something on that. There is something called the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which is a U.S. federal agency. It's not like the NDRC TK at home in that it doesn't plan development at home and have an external function. It's purely external. But my impression is that it's a relatively new agency, and it's designed to create matching incentives for private companies to invest abroad, rather than to guide all those processes. And we'll see how it works out. And then the other thing that might have some relation is the Millennium Challenge Corporation, but that's not for investment. That's for assistance. That's for foreign assistance. And much of the things that Hong has been talking about are loans and business deals that China's involved in abroad. It's not direct foreign assistance. So it's a little bit different, but that is guided by a government agency, and it guides U.S. assistance to developing countries who write a compact about how they'll use the money, and that compact gets vetted by the Millennium Challenge Corporation. But anyway, you can move on now.
And there is also a question about whether Pakistan project is stabilizing or destabilizing. Wow, I think maybe it's more destabilizing. I think India is very nervous about everything, the China-Pakistan cooperation, and also, this debt trap diplomacy thing was first suggested by an Indian commentator. And usually when you read any news report from Indian media, I usually wouldn't trust any Indian media when it comes to reporting about Chinese projects in Pakistan. I think there's a lot of really bias in these reports, and I think India doesn't like China-Pakistan cooperation at all.
Our next question comes from, I apologize if I get this name incorrect, but Iram Ashraf, who asks, as you presented the table on NDRC and the Ministry of Planning coming together under the JCC, where did or does the CPEC authority created by Pakistan fit into this collaboration between both countries? Also, while your work focuses between both countries at a higher level, do you know if both have created some body to bring grievances of companies or businesses at the ground level to the attention of the appropriate authorities as far as the CPEC project is concerned?
Yeah, the CPEC authority that was created was partly also motivated by the realization that, on the Chinese side, there is NDRC, which is a very strong government agency that coordinate all these things and make decisions. But while on the Pakistani side, the governance structure seems to be fragmented, and the federal government is really not able to do many things. And provincial governments usually, like in the case of SEZs, provincial governments are responsible for these projects, but sometimes they lack capacity. So then there was the idea to create a CPEC authority in Pakistan to kind of be able to serve as the one-stop government mechanism that supposedly solve some of the troubleshooting, some of the problems in the CPEC projects and things like that. And I know, Iram, you know this well, but I try to explain this to the audience. So CPEC authority, I think, so after CPEC authority was created, the JCC structure will still remain the same in the sense that the Pakistani side is still chaired by the Ministry of Planning. So in that sense, it wouldn't change much, but CPEC authority, no doubt, would take up a lot of responsibility in terms of overseeing the CPEC projects and communicating with the Chinese side in terms when problems arise. And supposedly they also would have some role to play in terms of policy input. But I don't know if that would cause major change to the existing governance structure, JCC structure. Probably not much. Also, the question about whether there will be grievances mechanisms, I have never heard of anything like that. So maybe that's to my knowledge, I haven't heard of anything regarding grievances resolution in the CPEC.
Our next question comes from a Julie Jin Zhang, who's the associate professor at Florida International University, who asks, is your analytical framework applicable to Chinese overseas engagement investments in other sectors, such as mining and the auto sectors? How can we tell if a Chinese multinational company investing abroad has the state backing?
And maybe you should ask Justin's as well, because we kind of have to wrap up.
Okay. I'll ask first part of Justin's too while you're thinking about that. I was curious about your slide. This is from Justin Canfield, sorry, who's another CWP fellow for this year. I was curious about your slide that showed that regulatory cooperation remains low and hasn't grown. Why is that? Is it low because China can dictate regulatory policy to participant countries, even Pakistan, or because China tends to engage with countries that share similar regulatory frameworks to begin with? Or is it also possible that because regulatory models diffusion isn't actually a priority for the NDRC, or something else entirely? And if we have time, we'll get to the second question.
So for the question about whether we can identify if a Chinese multinational company investing has state backing, I don't think there's a very general answer to that. If it has state backing, I think you need to see the project history, where it came from, and whether this company has been involved in some kind, whether it has some kind of direct, whether it received policy financing from China, that would be a direct indication, and whether the company participates in this kind of government-led mechanisms. So yeah, I don't think there's a very easy answer to whether to tell whether a company has state backing. Really needs to be analyzed case by case, project by project. Justin's question about, I think the bar, the bar chart that I showed earlier, maybe I need to clarify. the regulatory, that was the bar charts that I showed was about NDRC's international agreements over the years, and they are international agreements with all countries, not just any particular country. And in the previous period, there was a lot of regulatory policies, agreements. They were, if I remember correctly, they were mostly about other countries trying to engage China in terms of, kind of not harmonizing, but kind of trying to engage with China in terms of regulatory reforms. I can't now give a good example because some time since I looked into a specific, but it's the reduction didn't mean, I don't think the reduction in that specific indicator means China's change of attitude or anything. It's just in some previous periods, some other foreign countries, especially from Western countries, I think they try to engage in DRC in terms of making regulatory policies for specific sectors. I think maybe because they have been accomplished, or maybe because this kind of engagement is no longer possible, and so that's why we're not seeing so many of them in recent years. And of course, that database of I collected these agreements from just public sources, so they couldn't, they may not be complete. They may not reflect a complete picture. So I have to say that.
Okay, and Justin says that you managed to address his second question with your answer to his first one. So we are done, and we've run over about 5 minutes. So I really appreciate your endurance and your engagement of the many questions. And I always say that we can tell it's a good talk when there are so many questions, and you had a lot. So thanks so much for your presentation, and it's great to have you on board. And it's great to be in a collaboration with Deborah Brodigam and our program at Hopkins. And we look forward to the rest of the year.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Have a great night.